When you lose the person who understood you most, the silence becomes a living thing that follows you through empty rooms and sits beside you at the dinner table. Harold Boone had been wrestling with that silence for 8 months since Martha's passing, finding small comfort in the loyal presence of their 12-year-old golden retriever, Buddy, the last living connection to the life they built together. But Buddy's behavior had taken a troubling turn. Every evening at dusk, the old dog would abandon Harold's side and walk to the edge of their property, sitting perfectly still as he stared into the dark forest. Not the casual watching of a dog tracking scents, but something deeper and intensity that made Harold's chest tighten with worry. For 3 weeks, Buddy maintained this ritual, remaining motionless for hours as shadows stretched across the fields. Harold told himself it was grief, that animals mourn differently than people. Then came that stormy October night when Buddy finally rose and walked purposefully into those woods, stopping only to look back with eyes that seemed to say, "Follow me." What Harold discovered, buried beneath that weathered oak, would force him to confront a truth he'd spent decades avoiding. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning routine had become Harold's anchor in the 8 months since Martha passed. Rise at 5:30, coffee black and strong. Check the weather from the kitchen window that faced east toward the barn. The farmhouse felt too large now, too quiet, with only the soft padding of Buddy's paws on the hardwood floors to break the silence that had settled like dust over everything. Harold moved through the rooms with practiced efficiency, avoiding Martha's empty rocking chair by the wide fireplace where she used to sit with her quilting basket, humming old hymns while her needle caught the lamplight. The chair still held the impression of her small frame in its worn cushions, and sometimes Harold caught himself setting 2 coffee cups on the counter before remembering. The farm had been their shared dream for 43 years, 160 acres of rolling pasture and woodland in the gentle hills outside Millbrook, far enough from town to feel private but close enough that Martha could still drive to her church, auxiliary meetings, and Harold could get feed and supplies when needed. They'd raised Holstein cattle until Harold's back started giving him trouble 5 years ago, then switched to a smaller operation with chickens and a vegetable garden that Martha tended with the devotion of a mother. Now the chicken coop stood empty, the wire mesh beginning to sag. Harold had sold the birds after the funeral, unable to bear the daily reminder of Martha's gentle voice calling to them each morning. The vegetable garden had gone to weeds, though he'd finally managed to pull most of them last month when the sight of Martha's prize, tomato plants strangled by crabgrass, became too much to ignore. Buddy followed him through these morning rituals, a steady golden shadow who seemed to understand that routine was what kept Harold tethered to each day. The dog was showing his age graying around the muzzle, slower on the stairs, more inclined to nap in the sunny spots by the windows where he could keep one eye on Harold's movements. But there was still alertness in those brown eyes. Still, the eager anticipation when Harold reached for his jacket that meant they'd walk the property, lined together. These walks had become Harold's favorite part of the day. The familiar crunch of gravel under his boots, the way the morning light caught the spider webs stretched between the fence posts, the reliable weight of Buddy's presence beside him as they checked the boundaries of land that had been in Harold's family for 3 generations. His grandfather had homesteaded here in 1923, clearing the timber by hand and building the original farmhouse that still formed the heart of the current structure. Martha had understood the weight of that history. She'd spent countless evenings listening to Harold tell stories his grandfather had shared, about the hard winters when they'd burned furniture to stay warm, about the summer the creek ran dry and they'd had to haul water from town in milk cans. She'd helped him restore the old photographs and documents, creating a family archive that filled 2 cedar chests in the spare bedroom. But Martha had also understood the shadows in Harold's family history. She knew about Thomas, Harold's younger brother, though Harold rarely spoke of him. She knew about the argument that had driven Thomas away when Harold was 28 and Thomas was 25. She knew that Harold's stubborn pride had cost him the only sibling he'd ever had, and she gently suggested over the years that perhaps it was time to reach out, to forgive, to heal old wounds before it was too late. Harold had always deflected these conversations. Thomas had made his choice. Thomas was the one who'd walked away. Thomas was the one who'd chosen to disappear rather than apologize. If Thomas wanted reconciliation, he knew where to find Harold. Now, with Martha gone, Harold realized how much he'd relied on her wisdom to navigate the complicated territories of the heart. She'd been his compass for emotional decisions, the one who could talk him down from his ange and help him see past his pride. Without her steady influence, Harold felt adrift in ways that had nothing to do with the practical aspects of running a farm alone. The neighbors had been kind. Ben Cartwright from the adjacent property had offered to help with heavy work, and Sarah McKenna from down the road brought casseroles twice a week whether Harold wanted them or not. The pastor from Martha's church stopped by monthly, always, careful not to overstay his welcome but making sure Harold knew the congregation was thinking of him. But kindness couldn't fill the specific shape of Martha's absence. It couldn't replace the sound of her voice reading aloud from the newspaper over breakfast, or the sight of her hands working in the garden while she planned their dinner conversation, or the comfortable quiet of their evening routine when she'd knit and he'd read, and neither felt the need to fill the silence with unnecessary words. Harold had tried to maintain some version of their old rhythms. He still read the paper cover to cover each morning, though he no longer shared the interesting bits aloud. He still listened to the weather radio every evening, though there was no one to discuss tomorrow's forecast with over supper. He still walked the property line each day, but increasingly he found himself stopping at the forest edge where Buddy had begun his strange new ritual. The forest had always been Harold's boundary with mystery. Beyond the tree line, the land belonged to the state. Hundreds of acres of oak and pine that stretched back into hills where only hunters and hikers ventured. Harold had walked those woods as a boy with Thomas, following deer trails and looking for arrowheads, but as an adult, he'd rarely ventured beyond the edge of his own property. The forest represented wildness, unpredictability, the kind of uncontrolled space that made a farmer nervous. But Buddy seemed drawn to it now with an intensity that Harold couldn't understand. The behavior had started gradually, just longer. Pauses during their evening walks, the dog's attention caught by something in the darkness between the trees. Then the pauses became stops, and the stops became a nightly ritual that Harold found increasingly unsettling. Every evening at dusk, usually around 6:30 as the light began to fade, Buddy would walk deliberately to the same spot at the forest's edge, not wandering or exploring, but moving with purpose to a specific location where the old oak tree spread its massive branches over the fence line. There he would sit, perfectly still, facing into the woods with the kind of focused attention Harold had never seen in all their years together. Harold had tried everything he could think of to break the pattern. He'd called Buddy's name, offered treats, even tried physically guiding the dog back toward the house. But Buddy would resist gently, politely, returning to his vigil with the patient determination of someone keeping an important appointment. After an hour or two, he'd finally return to the house on his own, settling into his usual spot by Harold's recliner as if nothing unusual had happened. Martha's recipe box still sat on the kitchen counter where she'd left it, a wooden container, painted with faded roses that held 3 generations of family recipes, written in careful script on index cards yellowed with age. Harold had been unable to bring himself to move it, though he rarely cooked anything more complicated than soup from a can or sandwiches. That required no reference to Martha's careful notes about timing and seasonings that sometimes in the evening. Quiet, Harold would open the box and read through the cards. Not for the recipes, but for the glimpses they offered of Martha's personality. Her neat handwriting noting substitutions and modifications. Less salt Harold's pressure. Double the vanilla Thomas always loved this. Make extra church social. Each card a small window into the care she'd taken with every meal, every gathering, every gesture of love expressed through food. The mention of Thomas on several cards always gave Harold pause. Martha had known Harold's brother only briefly, during the early years of Harold and Martha's marriage, when Thomas would still visit occasionally. But she'd remembered his preferences and apparently planned to feed him again someday. It was typical of Martha's generous heart that she'd held space for reconciliation, even when Harold's pride wouldn't allow it. Now, as Harold sat in the gathering, darkness of another solitary evening, watching Buddy maintain his mysterious vigil at the forest's edge, he wondered if Martha had been right about the importance of healing old wounds before time ran out. Perhaps they were things worth confronting, even if it meant admitting he'd been wrong. Perhaps some silences were more costly than the temporary discomfort of difficult conversations. But Thomas was gone now, had been gone for decades without a word. Whatever chance they'd had for reconciliation had passed with Harold's stubborn insistence that the first move had to come from his younger brother. Now, there was only Buddy's strange behavior and the growing sense that something was calling to them from beyond the tree line. Something that wouldn't let Harold rest until he found the courage to follow his old dog into the darkness and discover what waited there. The storm had been building all day, the kind of October weather that reminded Harold why his grandfather had always finished the harvest early and made sure the firewood was stacked high before the month was out. Dark clouds had been massing since noon, and by evening the wind was bending the trees at angles that made Harold nervous about the power lines. He'd brought Buddy inside earlier than usual, hoping to avoid the nightly ritual at the forest's edge. But as 6:30 approached, the old dog became restless, pacing between Harold's recliner and the front door with an urgency that Harold had never seen before. When the first rumble of thunder rolled across the valley, Buddy moved to the door and began to whine, not the casual request to go outside that Harold was accustomed to, but something deeper, more insistent. "Not tonight, boy," Harold said, trying to keep his voice calm despite the growing unease in his chest. "That storm's going to be a bad one. We'll stay inside where it's safe." But Buddy wouldn't be deterred. He continued to pace, his whining increasing in pitch and urgency as the wind howled around the farmhouse, and the first fat drops of rain began to spatter against the windows. When a particularly loud crack of thunder shook the house, Buddy barked once sharp and commanding, then looked directly at Harold with an expression that was unmistakably a demand. Harold had lived with animals long enough to recognize when a creature was trying to communicate something important. This wasn't ordinary restlessness or fear of the storm. This was purposeful, urgent, as if Buddy knew something that Harold didn't and was running out of patience with Harold's failure to understand. "What is it, boy?" Harold asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "What's got you so worked up?" In response, Buddy walked to the coat closet and sat down directly in front of it, his tail thumping against the floor in the rhythm Harold recognized as the dog's most serious attempts at communication. The message was clear. "Get your coat. We're going outside." "And we're going now." Harold looked out the window at the darkening sky and the trees whipping in the wind. This was exactly the kind of weather that sensible people avoided, the kind of storm that brought down power lines and turned familiar paths treacherous. Every practical instinct he possessed told him to stay inside, to wait out the weather, to let Buddy's mysterious compulsion pass. But something in the dog's behavior, the urgency, the direct communication, the absolute certainty that this could not wait, finally overcame Harold's resistance. He'd trusted Buddy's instincts for 12 years, had learned to read the subtle signs that meant a stranger was approaching or the weather was about to turn. If Buddy was this insistent about going outside in a storm, perhaps there was something. Harold needed to see. Harold pulled on his heavy work coat and grabbed the old hurricane lantern from the shelf beside the door. The battery-powered spotlight would have been more practical, but something about the night seemed to call for the steady, warm glow of the kerosene flame that had guided his grandfather through countless dark nights on this same land. The moment Harold opened the door, Buddy shot past him into the storm with a speed and purpose that Harold hadn't seen in years. The dog moved like a creature half his age, bounding through the driving rain toward the forest's edge with an urgency that made Harold's heart race as he struggled to keep up. The wind was fierce, bending the grass flat and sending leaves and small branches flying through the air. Harold had to lean into it to make progress, the lantern's flame flickering behind its glass chimney as he fought to keep his footing on the increasingly muddy ground. The rain was cold and sharp, finding every gap in his clothing and running down his neck in icy streams that made him question his decision to leave the warm house. But Buddy never hesitated, never looked back, moving through the storm with the confidence of someone following a familiar path. When he reached the spot at the forest edge where he'd been keeping his nightly vigil, he didn't stop. Instead, he plunged directly into the woods, following what Harold could barely make out as a deer trail that wound between the massive trunks of the old oak trees. Harold had no choice but to follow, though every step took him further from the safety and familiarity of his own land. The lantern cast a small circle of yellow light that illuminated only a few feet in any direction, turning the forest into a maze of shifting shadows and sudden obstacles. Roots caught at his feet, low branches snagged his coat, and more than once he had to stop and call Buddy's name to make sure he was still heading in the right direction. The dog's golden coat was invisible in the darkness, but Harold could hear him moving steadily ahead, the sound of paws on wet leaves and the occasional snap of a twig marking his progress deeper into the woods. There was no randomness to Buddy's movement, no sniffing or exploring. He was traveling toward a specific destination with the confidence of someone who had made this journey before. As they moved deeper into the forest, Harold began to recognize landmarks from his childhood adventures with Thomas. There was the lightning-struck pine that they'd used as a fort, its hollow trunk still standing after 40 years. There was the creek bed that ran dry in summer but would be flowing fast tonight with storm runoff. There was the ridge where they'd found the old homestead foundation, just a few moss-covered stones that marked where someone had tried to build a life in these woods before the forest reclaimed it. The memories came flooding back, despite Harold's attempts to focus on keeping up with Buddy. He and Thomas had spent countless summer days in these woods, building elaborate fantasy games around the few artifacts they'd discovered from the area's earlier inhabitants. Thomas had always been the storyteller, spinning tales about hidden treasures and lost families, while Harold played the practical older brother, focused on getting home before their mother worried. It struck Harold now that this was the first time he'd ventured into these woods since Thomas had left. In all the years since their argument, Harold had kept to his own land, avoiding the places that carried too many memories of their shared childhood. But Buddy was leading him back into that territory now, past familiar landmarks towards something that Harold couldn't yet see but was beginning to fear he might understand. The wind was even fiercer among the trees, creating a constant roar of moving air and groaning wood that made Harold feel small and vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced since childhood. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating brief snapshots of the forest canopy and casting everything into stark black and white before plunging them back into the lantern's small circle of light. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only 20 minutes, Buddy finally stopped. Harold caught up to find the dog sitting perfectly still in a small clearing dominated by a massive oak tree that must have been standing when Harold's grandfather first cleared his land. The tree was clearly ancient, its trunk so wide that Harold could have hidden behind it completely, its branches spreading out in a canopy that provided some shelter from the driving rain. But something was wrong with the tree. Even in the flickering light of the lantern, Harold could see that one side of it was dying or already dead, the bark blackened and peeling away to reveal the pale wood beneath. Lightning strike, probably, though it must have happened years ago for the damage to be so extensive. Buddy sat at the base of the dying oak, looking up at Harold with an expression that seemed to say, "This is it. This is what I've been trying to show you." The dog's tail was still, his ears forward, his entire body focused on Harold with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. Harold held the lantern higher, trying to understand what Buddy wanted him to see. The ground around the tree's base was soft from years of fallen leaves and the night's rain, covered in the kind of rich mulch that formed when organic matter decomposed undisturbed. But as he looked more carefully, Harold began to notice something that made his breath catch in his throat. The earth was disturbed in a way that didn't match the natural patterns of root growth and seasonal leaf fall. There was a depression in the soil, roughly rectangular, as if something had been buried there long enough for the ground to settle, but recently enough that the outlines were still visible. And partially exposed by the storm's runoff was the corner of something that definitely wasn't natural, something metallic that caught the lantern's light and reflected it back in a dull gleam. Harold knelt beside the spot, his knees sinking into the wet earth as he brushed away leaves and loose soil with trembling hands. The metallic object was definitely man-made, square-cornered and substantial, buried perhaps 2 feet below the surface. It felt like a box or container, something meant to protect whatever was inside from the elements. As Harold worked to expose more of the object, Buddy moved closer, his nose nearly touching Harold's shoulder as if to encourage the work. The dog was perfectly calm now, his earlier urgency replaced by patient watchfulness, as if he understood that Harold was finally doing what needed to be done. Harold looked up at the dying oak tree, then down at the buried object, then at Buddy's steady gaze. Whatever was buried here had been calling to the old dog for weeks, drawing him back night after night to this spot in the forest. And now, in the middle of a storm that had driven every other living creature to shelter, Harold was about to discover what secret the woods had been keeping. Harold's hands were numb with cold by the time he managed to fully expose the buried object. It was indeed a metal box, roughly the size of a shoebox, but made of heavy steel that had resisted decades of moisture and soil chemistry. The corners were still sharp, the surface pitted with age but intact, with what appeared to be a simple hasp closure that had somehow stayed latched through all the years underground. The storm continued to rage overhead, but Harold barely noticed it now. His entire focus had narrowed to this moment, this discovery, this explanation for Buddy's mysterious behavior that was both more and less than he had expected. Someone had buried this box deliberately, carefully, in a spot that would be difficult to find unless you knew exactly where to look. Someone had marked the location with the massive oak tree, had chosen this clearing as a place where something important could wait safely for the right moment to be found. Harold lifted the box from its earthen resting place, surprised by its weight. Whatever was inside wasn't just papers or photographs. There was substance here, objects that had mattered enough to someone that they'd taken elaborate precautions to preserve them. The metal was cold against his palms, slick with moisture and soil, but he could feel the solid reality of it, the promise that whatever answers it contained were about to be revealed. Buddy pressed closer as Harold worked the simple latch, his warm body providing welcome contact in the cold and wet. The dog's breathing was steady and calm now, as if the urgency that had driven him into the storm had been satisfied by Harold's discovery of the box. Whatever mission Buddy had been on, it was accomplished. The rest was up to Harold. The latch opened with surprising ease, the metal mechanism still functional after all its years underground. Harold lifted the lid slowly, half afraid of what he might find, half desperate to know what secret had been worth such elaborate concealment. The lantern's light revealed the contents in fragments, white paper that had yellowed with age, the corner of what looked like a photograph, something wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from moisture. But it was the letter on top, addressed, in familiar handwriting to Harold, in the careful script he remembered from childhood. That made his hand shake so badly he nearly dropped the box. He knew that handwriting. He had seen it on Christmas cards and birthday notes, on the few letters that had arrived in the early years after the argument, before the silence became complete and permanent. Thomas. This was Thomas's handwriting. Thomas's box. Thomas's grave. Harold's vision blurred. The weather from the rain or sudden tears he couldn't tell. He had to read the letter, had to know what his brother had wanted to say badly enough to bury it where only the most determined search would reveal it. But his hands were shaking too badly to unfold the fragile paper in the storm, and the lantern's light was too unsteady to read by. "We have to get this home, boy," Harold said to Buddy, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't expected. "We have to see what Thomas wanted to tell us." The journey back through the woods felt different than the trip out. Harold moved more carefully now, protecting the box against his chest, Buddy staying close beside him as if he understood the precious nature of what they carried. The storm was beginning to ease, the lightning moving off toward the east and the wind dropping from a howl to a steady rush through the trees. But Harold barely noticed the weather. His mind was reeling with questions and possibilities, with the shocking realization that his brother had been here, had been close enough to bury this box in Harold's own woods. When had Thomas come back? How long had he stayed? Why hadn't he approached the house, hadn't knocked on Harold's door? How long ago had he died, and where was he buried now? The box might contain answers to some of these questions, but Harold suspected it would raise even more. Back in the warmth and light of the farmhouse kitchen, Harold set the box carefully on the table where Martha's recipe box still sat. The contrast was stark. Martha's painted roses and faded wood next to Thomas's utilitarian steel and rust. Two containers that held the memories and intentions of people Harold had loved, both now silent, both offering their secrets to his trembling hands. Harold dried the box carefully with a kitchen towel, then opened it again under the bright overhead light. The contents were more extensive than he'd realized in the forest. There were several letters, all in Thomas's handwriting, dated across a span of what looked like months. There were photographs, some of them family pictures Harold recognized from their childhood, others showing a young man Harold didn't recognize, but who had Thomas's eyes and chin. There was a compass, Harold's own compass, the one he'd given Thomas for his 12th birthday and never seen again. And wrapped in the oiled cloth was something that made Harold's breath catch, a small wooden carving of a dog that Thomas had made in shop class when he was 14. Harold picked up the carving with careful fingers, remembering the hours Thomas had spent working on it, the proud way he presented it to Harold as a gift. Harold had kept it on his desk through high school and college, had brought it with him when he and Martha moved to the farm. He'd assumed it was lost in one of their moves, had forgotten about it completely until this moment when seeing it brought back a flood of memories about his brother's patient craftsmanship and generous heart. Why did Thomas have it? When had he taken it? And why had he brought it back here, buried it with these letters and photographs like artifacts of a life he was trying to preserve or honor? Harold set the carving gently on the table and picked up the top letter, the one addressed simply to Harold in Thomas's careful script. The paper was fragile but still readable, protected by the metal box and the old cloth wrapping. Harold unfolded it slowly, his heart pounding as he prepared to hear his brother's voice for the first time in decades. "Dear Harold," the letter began, and even reading those two words silently, Harold could hear Thomas's voice as clearly as if his brother were sitting across the kitchen table. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you found what I left for you. I hope it was Buddy who led you here. I've been feeding him and talking to him for months, and I think he understands more than either of us ever gave him credit for." Harold looked down at Buddy, who was lying at his feet with his head resting on Harold's boots. The dog's eyes were alert, watching Harold's face as if he could read the emotions there and was waiting to see what would happen next. Had Thomas really been visiting regularly? Had Buddy been meeting him at the forest's edge all this time, keeping their secret with the loyalty of a creature who understood that some relationships were too complicated for human rules? "I know you're angry," the letter continued. "I know. You think I'm the one who left, who gave up on our family, who chose pride over love. And maybe you're right about some of that. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you, never stopped wanting to come home. I just didn't know how. I didn't know what words could bridge the gap between what I said that night and what I should have said instead." Harold had too. "Stop reading." The words were bringing back the night of their argument with vivid clarity, the raised voices, the accusations, the moment when Thomas had said things about their father that Harold couldn't forgive, and Harold had responded with words that cut deeper than he'd intended. It had been about money and responsibility and the different ways they'd each handled their father's drinking. But underneath it had been about love and disappointment and the fødediton and the fobenenet. Underneath it had been about love and disappointment and disappointment and the sandene, weight of expectations that neither brother had known how to carry. Thomas had walked out that night, and Harold had let him go. Pride and stubbornness had kept Harold from following, from apologizing, from admitting that maybe they'd both been wrong and both been hurt. By the time Harold's anger had cooled enough for him to consider reconciliation, Thomas was gone without a forwarding address, and Harold's attempts to find him had yielded nothing. Now, 37 years later, Harold was holding Thomas's words in his hands and learning that his brother had never stopped loving him, never stopped wanting to come home. The realization was overwhelming, bringing with it a grief that was different from what he'd felt when Martha died, sharper, more immediate, tinged with regret for all the lost years and unspoken forgiveness. Harold forced himself to continue reading, though each word felt like a weight settling on his chest. Thomas's letter continued with details that made Harold realize how little he'd understood about his brother's life after that terrible night. "I've been living in Millfield for the past 8 months," Thomas wrote, "just 30 miles from the farm. I know that probably shocks you, that I've been so close all this time without making contact. But I needed to work up the courage, needed to figure out what to say after all these years. I've driven past the farm entrance probably 50 times, always losing my nerve at the last minute." Millfield. Harold knew the town, had driven through it countless times on his way to the farm supply store in the county seat. Thomas had been that close, had probably seen Harold's truck on the road, had maybe even followed him home to know exactly where he lived. The thought of his brother watching from a distance, wanting to reconnect but afraid of Harold's reaction, made Harold's throat tighten with emotion. The letter went on to explain that Thomas had been working construction jobs, moving from town to town for decades, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. He'd married once, briefly, but it hadn't worked out. He'd tried to contact Harold several times over the years, but had always stopped short of actually making the call or sending the letter, paralyzed by the fear that Harold's anger had hardened into permanent rejection. "I know what you're thinking," Thomas wrote, and Harold could almost hear the gentle teasing in his brother's voice. "You're thinking I should have just knocked on the door, should have taken the risk instead of hiding in the woods like some kind of ghost. And you're right. But Harold, I was so afraid that you'd look at me and see only that angry 25-year-old who said terrible things about Dad, who walked away instead of trying to work things out. I was afraid you'd tell me it was too late, that too much time had passed, that some words can't be taken back. Harold had to set the letter down for a moment. He walked to the kitchen window and looked out toward the forest, where the storm was finally beginning to clear, and the first hints of dawn were showing in the eastern sky. Buddy had been meeting Thomas out there, Harold realized. The mysterious vigil that had worried Harold so much had actually been a reunion, a loyal dog maintaining a connection between two stubborn brothers who couldn't find their way back to each other on their own. When Harold felt steady enough to continue, he picked up the letter again and found that Thomas had included practical details that brought the reality of his presence into sharp focus. He'd been living in a small apartment above the hardware store in Millfield, working for a contractor who specialized in historic restoration. He'd been attending AA meetings, a detail that surprised Harold, since he hadn't known Thomas had a drinking problem, though perhaps it shouldn't have been surprising given their father's struggles with alcohol. "I've been sober for 4 years now," Thomas wrote, "and one of the things they tell you in the program is that you need to make amends to the people you've hurt. I know I hurt you that night, Harold. I know I said things about Dad that were cruel and unfair, even if some of them were true. I was angry and scared, and I took it out on you because you were the only one strong enough to take it. That wasn't fair, and I'm sorry." Harold remembered that night differently. In his memory, Thomas had been the one who'd been hurt, the one who needed comfort and understanding that Harold had been too proud, angry to give. But perhaps they'd both been right, both been wrong, both been carrying wounds that had never properly healed. The letter included an address and phone number information that Harold could have used to contact Thomas if he'd known to look for it. But Harold realized with growing shame that he'd never really tried to find his brother, not seriously. He told himself that Thomas was the one who'd left. Thomas was the one who needed to make the first move, but the truth was that Harold had been just as afraid of rejection as Thomas apparently had been. There was more to the letter, but Harold found himself setting it aside to examine the other contents of the box. The photographs told a story he hadn't expected, pictures of Thomas at various ages, in different places, often with other people who'd apparently become his chosen family over the years. Construction crews, groups, the kind of temporary communities that formed around shared work or shared struggles. But it was the compass that affected Harold most deeply. He picked it up with careful fingers, remembering the Christmas morning when he'd given it to 12-year-old Thomas, explaining how their grandfather had taught Harold to use one during their walks in the woods. Thomas had been fascinated by the idea of always knowing which direction was home, had practiced with it for hours until he could navigate their familiar woods even on cloudy days when the sun wasn't visible. Harold opened the compass case and was surprised to find that it still worked perfectly, the needle swinging to point steadily north despite its decades underground. But there was something else inside the case, something that hadn't been there when Harold had given it to Thomas all those years ago. Tucked behind the compass face was a small piece of paper, folded tiny and wedged into the space so carefully that Harold almost missed it. He worked the paper out with gentle fingers, unfolding it to reveal another note in Thomas's handwriting, this one much more recent based on the ink and paper quality. It was brief, just a few lines, but those lines made Harold's hand shake as he read them. "Harold, I found this in Dad's things when he died last year. He kept it all these years, said it reminded him of you and the man you grew up to be. I think he was proud of both of us, even if he never figured out how to say it. I'm leaving. This where you'll find it someday, along with the other things I wanted you to have. I love you, brother. I always have." Thomas' dad had died last year. Harold read the note again, trying to process this information. Their father, who Harold had assumed had died years ago, had apparently lived long enough to see Thomas again, to be reconciled with at least one of his sons. And Thomas had been there for him, had cared for him in his final illness, had been the dutiful son that Harold had never managed to be. The guilt was overwhelming. While Harold had been nursing his pride and his grievances, Thomas had been doing the hard work of forgiveness and family responsibility. While Harold had been telling himself that Thomas was the one who'd abandoned their family, Thomas had actually been holding it together, caring for their aging father, trying to find a way back to the brother who'd rejected him. Harold walked to Martha's rocking chair and sat down heavily, the compass still clutched in his hands. Buddy followed, settling beside the chair with a soft sigh that seemed to acknowledge the weight of the revelations they'd uncovered. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind the clean, fresh smell of rain-washed air and the first clear light Harold had seen in days. But inside, Harold felt like he was just beginning to weather his own storm. Everything he'd believed about his relationship with Thomas, everything he'd told himself about who was responsible for their estrangement, was being turned upside down. Thomas hadn't given up on their family, Harold had. Thomas hadn't chosen pride over love, Harold had. Thomas had been the one trying to find his way home, while Harold had been the one keeping the door locked. The compass needle pointed steadily north, just as it had when they were children learning to navigate the woods together. But Harold realized now that he'd lost his way long ago, had been walking in circles for decades while convincing himself he was moving forward. Thomas had tried to be his compass, had tried to lead him back to what mattered most, but Harold had been too stubborn to follow. Now Thomas was gone, and Harold was left with a box full of love letters and artifacts, with a faithful dog who'd kept his brother's secret, and with the crushing realization that the reconciliation he'd spent 37 years avoiding had been within reach all along. Harold spent the rest of that sleepless night reading through every piece of paper in Thomas's box, piecing together a story that grew more heartbreaking with each revelation. There were letters Thomas had written but never sent, drafts of conversations he planned to have with Harold, journal entries that chronicled his struggle to find the courage to come home. One letter, dated just 3 months ago, contained an address for the Millfield funeral home and a receipt for cremation services for James Harold Boone Sr., their father. Harold stared at the receipt for a long time, trying to process the fact that his father had kept Harold's name as his middle name, despite everything that had passed between them, despite Harold's absence from his final years. Thomas had attached a note to the receipt. Dad asked about you every day toward the end. I told him you were doing well, that you'd built a good life with Martha on the farm. He seemed to find peace in that, even though he wished he could see you one more time. I hope I did the right thing, not telling you he was sick. He made me promise not to contact you unless you contacted us first. He said he didn't want to burden you with guilt if you weren't ready to forgive. Harold had to stop reading. The kitchen was filling with morning light now, but he felt like he was drowning in darkness, suffocating under the weight of missed opportunities and misunderstood intentions. His father had been protecting him, even in death. Thomas had been honoring that wish, even though it meant carrying the burden of their father's final illness alone. When Buddy pressed against his legs, Harold reached down to stroke the dog's golden head and found comfort in the warm, solid presence of the one family member who'd never given up on love. Buddy had somehow understood what the humans couldn't. That love was stronger than pride. That loyalty transcended old wounds. That some connections were too important to let break completely. By mid-morning, Harold had made a decision. He needed to go to Millfield, needed to see where Thomas had been living, needed to talk to people who'd known his brother in those final months. The box had given him pieces of the story, but Harold sensed there was more to learn, more to understand about the man Thomas had become and the life he'd been living so close to home. Harold drove the 30 miles to Millfield with Buddy in the passenger seat, the box of Thomas's belongings secured in the back of his truck. The town was smaller than Harold remembered, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business and strangers were noticed immediately. Harold parked on Main Street and sat for a moment, trying to imagine Thomas walking these sidewalks, shopping in these stores. building a temporary life while he worked up the courage to drive those last 30 miles home. The hardware store was easy to find, a weathered building with apartments above it and a for rent sign in one of the second-floor windows. Harold's chest tightened as he realized he was probably looking at Thomas's former home, the place where his brother had spent his final months writing letters he'd never sent and planning a reunion that would never happen. Harold pushed through the front door of the hardware store, causing a bell to jingle and an elderly man behind the counter to look up with friendly curiosity. "Help you find something?" the man asked, and Harold realized he hadn't planned what to say, how to explain what he was looking for. "I'm looking for information about Thomas Boone," Harold said finally. "I understand he was living upstairs, working construction. I'm his brother." The man's expression shifted immediately, becoming sympathetic and sad. "You're Harold," he said. "Not a question, but a statement of recognition. Tom talked about you all the time. I'm Bill Hensley. I own this place." Tom rented the apartment for about 8 months. Harold felt a chill at hearing Thomas referred to as Tom, a familiarity that spoke of genuine friendship, of people who'd cared about his brother in ways Harold never had the chance to. "Did you know him well?" Harold asked. "Well enough," Bill said, coming around the counter to shake Harold's hand. "Good man. Quiet, reliable, never caused any trouble. Did beautiful work. I hired him to restore some of the original fixtures in here, and you couldn't tell where the old wood ended and his repairs began. He had real craftsmanship." Harold followed Bill's gesture toward the restored woodwork around the store's windows and door frames. The work was indeed beautiful, careful, and precise, showing the same attention to detail that Harold remembered from Thomas's childhood projects. It was comforting to know that his brother had found outlets for his talents, had been appreciated for his skills, even if Harold had never acknowledged them properly. "He talked about you," Bill continued. "About the farm, about growing up there. He was proud of what you'd built, proud of your marriage to Martha. When she passed, Tom was pretty torn up about it. He wanted to come to the funeral, but he wasn't sure you'd want him there." Harold felt another stab of guilt. Thomas had wanted to comfort him during the worst period of his grief, but Harold's years of silence had made his brother feel unwelcome, even at Martha's funeral. How different those terrible months might have been if Harold had known Thomas was nearby, if they'd been able to mourn together and support each other through the loss. "Did he ever say why he didn't contact me directly?" Harold asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Bill nodded slowly. He was scared, to be honest. Said you two had words years back, and he wasn't sure those words could be taken back. He kept thinking he'd work up the nerve to drive out to your place, but every time he got close, he'd lose his courage and turn around. I told him family was family, that you'd probably welcome him home, but Tom was convinced you were better off without him. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another customer, a middle-aged woman who nodded to Bill and then stopped when she saw Harold. "You're Thomas's brother," she said with the same immediate recognition that Bill had shown. "I can see the family resemblance. I'm Susan McKay. I work at the diner where Tom ate most of his meals." Harold realized that Thomas had become part of this small community in ways that Harold had never been part of his own community in Millbrook. People here had known Thomas personally, had cared about him, had noticed his absence when he died. Harold found himself grateful for that, for the evidence that his brother hadn't spent his final months completely alone. Tom was planning something special, Susan said, her voice gentle but determined, as if she'd been waiting for this opportunity to share important information. He'd been saving money, asking questions about catering and flowers. "I think he was planning to surprise you somehow, maybe show up at your door with a proper peace offering." Harold felt tears starting and didn't try to stop them. The image of Thomas planning a reconciliation, saving money for a gesture that would bridge the gap between them, was almost unbearable in its tenderness. His brother had been thinking about love and forgiveness, while Harold had been nursing old grievances, had been planning for a future together, while Harold had been dwelling in the past. Bill and Susan seemed to understand Harold's need for a moment to compose himself. They waited patiently while he wiped his eyes and tried to process this new information about Thomas's final intentions. When Harold felt ready to speak again, he asked the question that had been haunting him since he'd found the box. "Do you know where he's buried?" Bill and Susan exchanged a look that Harold couldn't quite interpret, something that suggested they knew more than they were saying. It was Susan who spoke first, her voice careful and measured in a way that made Harold's stomach tighten with apprehension. "Harold, there's something you need to understand about Tom's final weeks," she said. "He wasn't just planning to contact you. He was getting his affairs in order because he knew he was dying." The words hit Harold like a physical blow. He gripped the edge of the counter to steady himself, his mind reeling with this new information. "Dying? What do you mean?" Bill stepped closer, his weathered face kind but serious. "Cancer. Tom found out about 6 months ago. Started treatment down in the city, but it was pretty advanced by the time they caught it. The doctors gave him maybe a year, and Tom decided he wanted to spend whatever time he had left close to home." Harold felt the room spinning around him. Thomas had been dying, had known he was dying, and had still spent his final months trying to find the courage to reconcile with the brother who'd shut him out. The selflessness of it, the pure love that had motivated Thomas to use his last months on Earth pursuing forgiveness rather than harboring resentment, was overwhelming. "He didn't want pity," Susan continued gently. "That's what he told us when we found out. He said he'd wasted too many years already feeling sorry for himself, and he wasn't going to waste the time he had left. He wanted to make things right with the people who mattered to him." "People," Harold repeated, catching the plural. "Who else?" Bill and Susan exchanged that look again, and Harold realized there was still more to learn, still more pieces of Thomas's story that would reshape everything Harold thought he knew about his brother's life. "Tom had a son," Bill said finally. "David. Lives out in Colorado with his little girl." Tom hadn't seen them in years. Another relationship he'd let his pride and his drinking damage. But once he got sober, once he found out about the cancer, he started trying to rebuild that connection too. Harold sat down heavily on a stool beside the counter, his legs suddenly unable to support him. A nephew. He had a nephew named David, and a great niece he'd never met. Thomas had been a father, had created a family that Harold knew nothing about, and had been working to heal those relationships in the same way he'd been trying to heal his relationship with Harold. Tom talked about David all the time once he got up the nerve to start calling him, Susan said. Showed us pictures of his granddaughter, Emma. I think her name was. Cutest little thing, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Tom was so proud of them, so sorry for all the years he'd missed because of his own problems. Harold thought about the photographs in Thomas's box, the pictures of a young man with Thomas's features that Harold hadn't recognized. David, his nephew, family that Harold had never known existed, family that Thomas had been protecting and providing for while Harold had been convincing himself that Thomas was irresponsible and unreliable. Did David know about the cancer? Harold asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Bill nodded slowly. Tom called him right after the diagnosis. David wanted to come out, wanted to help with the treatment, but Tom wouldn't let him. Sighed David had his own life to worry about, his own family to take care of. But they talked every week sometimes. More. Tom was trying to be the father he should have been all along, even if it was too late to do it in person. Harold was beginning to understand the full scope of Thomas's final mission. His brother hadn't just been trying to reconcile with Harold, he'd been trying to heal an entire family, to repair all the relationships his drinking and his pride had damaged over the years. The box buried under the oak tree wasn't just a message to Harold. It was part of a larger effort to ensure that the family connections Thomas couldn't rebuild in life might somehow survive his death. "There's something else," Susan said, reaching into her purse and pulling out an envelope with Harold's name written on it in Thomas's familiar handwriting. "Tom gave this to me about 2 weeks before he died. Made me promise to give it to you if you ever came looking for him." Harold took the envelope with shaking hands. It was thicker than the letters he'd found in the box, and heavier, as if it contained more than just paper. He opened it carefully and found several pages of Thomas's writing along with what appeared to be legal documents and a small key. The letter was different from the others Harold had read. This one was written with the clarity and urgency of someone who knew time was running out, someone who had important information to convey and was determined to get it right. "Harold," it began, "if Susan is giving you this letter, it means I'm gone and you've finally come looking for me. I hope that means you found the box I buried and that Buddy was able to lead you to it. I've been feeding him and talking to him for months, and I think he understands that he has an important job to do when I'm not here anymore." Harold glanced down at Buddy, who was lying patiently at his feet, and felt a fresh wave of amazement at the dog's intelligence and loyalty. Thomas had trained Buddy to be his messenger, had somehow communicated to the animal that Harold would need to be led to the truth when the time was right. "The documents in this envelope are copies of Dad's medical records from his final year," the letter continued. "I want you to know that he didn't suffer, that he had good care, and that he talked about you every day. He kept a picture of you and Martha on his bedside table, and he made me promise to tell you that he was proud of the man you became, even if he never figured out how to say it while he was alive." Harold had to stop reading to wipe his eyes. The thought of his father keeping his picture close during his final illness, of dying with Harold's face among the last things he saw each day, was almost unbearable. Harold had spent so many years convinced that his father was disappointed in him, that their relationship had been irreparably damaged by Harold's inability to fix his father's drinking problem. "The key is to a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Millfield," Thomas's letter went on. "Box number 247. Inside, you'll find some things Dad wanted you to have, along with information about David that I think you need to know. Harold, our nephew, is struggling. He's a good man, a good father, but he's been raising Emma on his own since his wife died 3 years ago, and he's having a hard time making ends meet. I've been sending him what money I could, but with me gone, he's going to need help." Harold felt the weight of new responsibility settling on his shoulders. Thomas was asking him to step into the role of family provider, to care for relatives he'd never met because they were connected by blood and love to the brother Harold had failed to reconcile with in life. It was a heavy burden, but also a gift, a chance to honor Thomas's memory by completing the work of family healing that Thomas had started. "I know this is a lot to ask," Thomas's letter concluded, "especially when we never got the chance to work things out between us. But Harold, you're the only family David and Emma have left now, and they're good people who deserve better than what life has given them so far. I'm trusting you to do what I couldn't to be the brother and uncle and grandfather that our family needs." Harold folded the letter carefully and looked up to find Bill and Susan watching him with patient sympathy. They'd clearly known at least part of what the letter contained, had been waiting for Harold to discover the full scope of the responsibility Thomas was passing on to him. "Tom was a good man," Bill said quietly. "He made mistakes, sure, but he spent his last months trying to make things right. That's got to count for something." Harold nodded, feeling the truth of those words in his bones. Thomas had been a better man than Harold had given him credit for, had been working toward forgiveness and reconciliation, while Harold had been nurturing old grievances. Now Harold had the chance to continue that work, to complete the mission of family healing that his brother had started. But first, he needed to visit that safety deposit box. He needed to understand the full extent of Thomas's legacy, and he needed to figure out how to contact a nephew who didn't know Harold existed, who might not welcome contact from a stranger claiming to be family. The path forward was uncertain, but for the first time in months, Harold felt like he had a purpose beyond simply getting through each day. Buddy seemed to sense the shift in Harold's mood. The dog stood and moved closer, pressing against Harold's legs with the solid comfort of a friend who understood that the hardest part of the journey was just beginning. The First National Bank of Millfield was a small brick building that looked like it hadn't changed much since Harold's grandfather's time. Harold sat in his truck for several minutes before going in, trying to prepare himself for whatever revelations Thomas's safety deposit box might contain. The key felt warm in his palm, worn smooth by handling, as if Thomas had taken it out and held it many times during his final months. The bank clerk, a young woman who introduced herself as Jennifer, was efficient and kind as she led Harold through the process of accessing the box. Thomas had apparently made arrangements for Harold to have access and provided documentation that established their relationship and Harold's right to the contents. It was another example of Thomas's careful planning, his determination to ensure that important information wouldn't be lost when he was gone. The safety deposit box was larger than Harold had expected, and it was packed with documents, photographs, and personal items that represented a lifetime of careful preservation. Harold carried the box to a private room and spread its contents across the small table, trying to make sense of the archive his brother had assembled. The first thing that caught Harold's attention was a thick folder labeled David and Emma in Thomas's careful handwriting. Inside were dozens of photographs spanning what looked like 20 years, from pictures of a baby that must have been David to recent photos of a man Harold's own age with a little girl who had Thomas's bright smile and curious eyes. Harold studied the photographs with growing amazement. Here was his family, his nephew, his great-niece living their lives in Colorado, while Harold had been completely unaware of their existence. The photos told a story of birthdays and Christmases, of school events and family vacations, of a father raising his daughter with obvious love and dedication, despite whatever challenges they'd faced. There were letters, too, dozens of them, showing a correspondence between Thomas and David that had clearly deepened over the past few years. Harold read them in chronological order, watching the relationship rebuild itself from awkward first contact to genuine warmth and mutual respect. David's early letters were cautious, protective, clearly written by someone who'd been hurt before and wasn't sure he could trust his father's renewed interest in his life. But Thomas's responses were patient and consistent, full of genuine remorse for his failures as a father and grandfather. And gradually, David's letters became longer, more personal, filled with details about his life as a single father and his struggles to provide for Emma after his wife's death from breast cancer. The most recent exchange, dated just weeks before Thomas's death, brought tears to Harold's eyes. David had written about Emma's upcoming birthday, about his worry that he couldn't afford the bicycle she'd been hoping for, about his fear that he was failing her the way Thomas had once failed him. Thomas's response was immediate and practical. A check for $500 with a note that said, "Every little girl deserves a bicycle. Tell Emma it's from her grandfather, who loves her even though he can't be there to see her ride it." Harold found David's thank you note at the bottom of the folder, along with a photograph of Emma standing next to a bright red bicycle, her face radiant with joy. On the back of the photograph, David had written, "Emma says to tell Grandpa Thomas that this is the best birthday present ever, and she's going to ride it every day until she can come visit him." But David would never get the chance to visit Thomas, and Emma would never meet the grandfather who'd loved her enough to ensure she got her birthday wish. Harold felt the weight of that loss, not just for himself, but for David and Emma, who'd been building a relationship with Thomas that his death had cut short. There were financial documents, too, showing that Thomas had been more responsible in his final years than Harold would have expected. He'd had a modest life insurance policy that named David as the beneficiary, along with a small savings account that he'd been contributing to regularly. It wasn't a fortune, but it was evidence of a man trying to provide for his family's future, even when his own future was uncertain. The most surprising discovery was a manila envelope marked for Harold's consideration that contained what appeared to be a detailed proposal for David and Emma to move closer to the family farm. Thomas had researched job opportunities in the area, had looked into school districts and housing options, had even identified a small house for sale just a few miles from Harold's property that would be perfect for a single father and his daughter. The proposal was thorough and thoughtful, showing that Thomas had given serious consideration to how he might bring the scattered pieces of their family back together. There were maps and real estate listings, school information, and employment possibilities, all organized with the care of someone who understood that successful reunification required more than just good intentions. At the bottom of the envelope was a note that made Harold's breath catch. "Harold, I know this is presumptuous, but I've been thinking about how much better Emma's life could be if she had family nearby. David is a good father, but he's struggling, and Emma needs more stability than he can provide on his own right now. You have room on the farm, you have the resources to help, and most importantly, you have a good heart even if you've forgotten how to show it sometimes. I'm not asking you to take the men David's too proud for charity, but maybe you could find a way to be the uncle and great-uncle they need, the way I should have been the brother you needed." Harold sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the scope of Thomas's vision. His brother hadn't just been trying to heal old wounds. He'd been trying to create a new kind of family, one that could provide support and stability for David and Emma, while giving Harold the chance to be part of something larger than his own grief and isolation. The final item in the box was a small address book with David's contact information carefully written in Thomas's hand. Address, phone number, email, even Emma's school and David's workplace. Everything Harold would need to reach out to his nephew, if he could find the courage to make that first contact. Harold closed the box and sat in the bank's quiet room for a long time, trying to process everything he'd learned. In the space of 24 hours, his understanding of his family had been completely transformed. Thomas wasn't the irresponsible younger brother who'd abandoned his family. He was the one who'd been holding it together, caring for their father, rebuilding his relationship with his son, planning for everyone's future, even as his own was ending. And now Harold was the only one left who could continue the work. David and Emma were his family, his responsibility, his opportunity to honor Thomas's memory by completing the mission of reconciliation and care that Thomas had started. The question was whether Harold had the courage to reach out to strangers who might not want anything to do with an uncle they'd never known existed. Harold thought about Martha, about what she would have said if she'd known about David and Emma. She would have insisted on contact, would have found a way to welcome them into the family regardless of the complicated history that had kept them apart. She would have seen them as blessings rather than burdens, as opportunities for love rather than sources of obligation. Buddy was waiting patiently in the truck when Harold finally emerged from the bank, the safety deposit box contents secured in a folder under his arm. The dog seemed to sense that important decisions were being made, that the mission he'd started by leading Harold to Thomas's box was entering a new phase that would require different kinds of courage. Harold sat in the truck for several minutes, David's phone number written on a piece of paper in his hand. All he had to do was dial, introduce himself, explain who he was and how he'd found David's contact information. It should have been simple, but Harold found himself paralyzed by the same fear that apparently stopped Thomas so many times from making the drive to Harold's farm. What if David didn't want contact with Harold? What if he was suspicious of a stranger claiming to be family? What if Harold said the wrong thing, made the wrong impression? drove away the last connections to Thomas before he'd even had a chance to honor his brother's memory properly. But as Harold looked at Buddy's patient face, he realized that some risks were worth taking, that some connections were too important to let fear win. Thomas had spent his final months working up the courage to reach out to the people he loved. The least Harold could do was find the courage to continue that work, to complete the circle of family healing that Thomas had started. Harold pulled out his phone and dialed David's number before he could change his mind. As it rang, he found himself praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore, that this conversation would be the beginning of something good rather than the end of his last chance at family. The phone rang 4 times before a cautious voice answered. "Hello?" Harold's throat went dry. After 37 years of silence between the brothers, after months of Thomas trying to work up the courage to make contact, Harold was about to bridge that gap with a phone call to a nephew who had no idea he existed. "Is this David Boone?" Harold asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Yes. Who's calling?" The wariness in David's voice was evident, the tone of someone who'd learned to be careful about unexpected phone calls. Harold took a deep breath. "My name is Harold Boone. I'm your father's brother. I know this is going to sound strange, but I just found out about you and Emma, and I needed to call." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Harold wondered if the connection had been lost. When David finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, though Harold could hear the emotion underneath. "Uncle Harold? Dad talked about you all the time, but he said you two weren't in contact. He said there had been some kind of argument years ago." "There was," Harold admitted. "A terrible one. I've spent the last day learning just how wrong I was about everything that happened afterward. David, I'm so sorry. I didn't know about you. Didn't know about Emma. Didn't even know that Thomas had been sick. If I had known—" "Wait," David interrupted. "What do you mean, had been sick? Dad called me last week. He sounded fine." Harold felt his heart sink. David didn't know. Thomas had died without David knowing how serious his condition had become, without his son being able to say goodbye properly. Harold realized he was about to deliver devastating news to a man he'd never met, and he had no idea how to do it gently. "David, I'm afraid I have some very difficult news. Thomas died 3 days ago. The cancer that he'd been fighting, it happened very quickly at the end." The silence this time was different, heavier, filled with the weight of sudden grief. "When?" David spoke again. His voice was barely a whisper. "Cancer? What cancer?" Dad never said anything about cancer. He said he was doing well, said he was working on some projects, that he might be able to visit us soon. Harold closed his eyes, understanding now why Thomas had kept the full truth from his son. He'd wanted David to remember him as he'd been, in their rebuilding relationship, not as a dying man whose time was running out. It was a generous deception, but it left David unprepared for the reality of his loss. "He didn't want you to worry," Harold said gently. "From what I've learned, he'd been sick for about 6 months, but he was more concerned with healing your relationship than with his own health. He wanted to be the father he should have been, even if it was too late to do it for very long." Harold could hear David crying quietly, and he wished desperately that he could be there in person, could offer the kind of comfort that this conversation required. Instead, he was delivering life-changing news to a stranger over the phone, trying to bridge decades of separation with words that felt inadequate for the weight they had to carry. "I'm flying out," David said suddenly, his voice stronger now, decisive. "Emma and I will get on a plane today. I need to see where he lived, need to understand what happened. And I need to meet you, if you're willing. Dad always said you were a good man, even though you two couldn't find your way back to each other." Harold felt a warmth spread through his chest that he hadn't experienced since Martha's death. David wanted to meet him, wanted to bring Emma to meet their family. Thomas's plan for reunification was happening faster than anyone could have expected. Driven by grief, but motivated by love. "Of course I'm willing," Harold said. "More than willing. You can stay at the farm. There's plenty of room, and it would mean everything to me to have you here." They spent the next hour making arrangements. David would fly into the regional airport with Emma the following evening. Harold would pick them up, would bring them to the farm where Thomas had grown up, where David's grandfather had died peacefully in his sleep, where the family stories and connections could be shared properly. For the first time, but after Harold hung up the phone, the reality of what he'd committed to began to sink in. He was about to host family members he'd never met, people who were grieving a loss that Harold was still trying to understand himself. Emma was 8 years old and had just lost her grandfather. David was dealing with the sudden knowledge that his father had been dying while pretending to be well. And Harold was the man who'd failed to reconcile with Thomas in life, but was now responsible for helping Thomas's family process his death. The farm, which had felt too empty since Martha's passing, suddenly felt overwhelming in its potential to accommodate the grief and needs of people he barely knew. Harold walked through the house, trying to see it through the eyes of visitors, realizing how much it reflected his months of solitary living. Dishes stacked in the sink, laundry piled on chairs, the kind of bachelor disorder that accumulated. When no one else was coming home, Harold spent the rest of the day cleaning with an energy he hadn't felt in months. He changed sheets in the guest rooms, restocked the refrigerator, even picked flowers from Martha's neglected garden to put in vases around the house. It felt good to have a purpose beyond his own daily survival, to be preparing his home to welcome family rather than simply existing in it alone. But as evening approached, Harold found himself facing a crisis of confidence that threatened to undo all his preparations. What did he know about entertaining an 8-year-old girl? What could he offer David in terms of comfort or wisdom? What right did he have to step into the role of family patriarch when he'd spent decades avoiding the responsibilities of family altogether? Harold walked out to the forest edge where Buddy had led him to Thomas's box, looking for some kind of reassurance in the place where this journey had begun. The massive oak tree stood silent in the gathering dusk, its damaged trunk a reminder that even dying things could shelter important secrets, could nurture new growth from old wounds. Buddy seemed to understand Harold's need for reflection. The dog sat beside him quietly, no longer focused on the forest but attentive to Harold's mood, ready to provide whatever comfort was needed. Harold realized that Buddy had completed the mission Thomas had given him. The box had been found. The letters had been read. The phone call had been made. Now, it was up to Harold to continue the work that Thomas had started. Harold thought about Martha, about the way she'd always make guests feel welcome regardless of the circumstances that brought them together. She'd had a gift for creating comfort. Out of simple things, good food, attentive listening, the sense that whatever was troubling you would somehow be manageable in her presence. Harold didn't have Martha's natural warmth, but he had her example, her memory of how love should be expressed in practical acts of care. He also had Thomas's letters, Thomas's photographs, Thomas's careful documentation of the family connections he'd been working to rebuild. Harold could share those things with David and Emma, could help them understand the man Thomas had been in his final months, could show them that their grandfather had died surrounded by love, even if he died without the family reunion he'd been planning. The next evening, Harold found himself standing in the small regional airport, holding a sign with David and Emma Boone, written in his careful script. He'd dressed in his best clothes, had brought Buddy along for moral support, and had spent the drive to the airport practicing conversations in his head. But when he saw a tall man with Thomas's features walking toward him with a little girl, whose smile was unmistakably family, all of Harold's practiced words disappeared. "Uncle Harold?" David asked, and when Harold nodded, David stepped forward and embraced him with the kind of desperate hug that people share when they're holding on to each other as much as they're holding on to hope. Emma hung back slightly, clearly uncertain about this stranger who claimed to be family, but whose existence she'd just learned about. Harold knelt down to her level, remembering how Martha had always made children feel seen and important. "You must be Emma," he said gently. "I'm your great-uncle Harold, and this is Buddy. He's the dog who helped me find the letters your grandfather left for us." Emma's eyes brightened with interest. "Grandpa Thomas wrote letters? What did they say?" Harold felt tears starting again, but this time they were accompanied by something that felt like hope. "They said that he loved you very much, and that he was proud to be your grandfather. Would you like to see them when we get to the farm?" Emma nodded solemnly, and Harold realized that Thomas's mission of family healing was entering its final phase. The letters would be shared, the stories would be told, and somehow, out of all the loss and missed opportunities, a new kind of family would begin to take shape. It wouldn't replace what they'd lost, but it might honor Thomas's memory by proving that love could survive even the longest silences, even the deepest regrets, even death itself. The drive back to the farm was both awkward and profound, filled with the kind of careful conversation that happens when strangers discover their family. Emma sat in the back seat with Buddy, her small hand resting on the dog's golden head, while she peppered Harold with questions about the farm, about her grandfather's childhood, about why she'd never met her great-uncle before. David sat in the passenger seat, studying Harold's profile as if trying to reconcile the stories his father had told with the reality of the man beside him. Harold could feel the weight of that scrutiny, the natural suspicion of someone who'd learned not to trust too quickly, who'd been hurt by family before and wasn't eager to repeat the experience. "Dad always said you were stubborn," David said. Finally, his tone careful but not unkind. "He said that was both your greatest strength and your biggest weakness." Harold glanced at his nephew, seeing Thomas's features, but older, more weathered by life's disappointments. He was right about that. "I spent 37 years being too stubborn to admit I was wrong about our argument. By the time I realized how much I'd lost, it was too late to fix it." "Maybe," David said quietly, "but you're here now. That has to count for something." They drove through the familiar countryside as evening shadows stretched across the fields, past farms that had been neighbors to Harold's family for generations. Harold found himself seeing the landscape through Emma's eyes, trying to imagine what it looked like to a little girl who'd grown up in suburban Colorado, who'd never experienced the kind of rural quiet that settled over these hills at dusk. "Is that where you live?" Emma asked as they turned into the long gravel driveway that led to the farmhouse. "That's home," Harold said, feeling the truth of those words in a way he hadn't since Martha's death. The farmhouse looked different, with family coming to visit warmer, somehow more purposeful, as if the building itself understood that it was about to fulfill its function as a gathering place for people who belonged together. Harold had prepared the guest rooms carefully, had put Emma in the small bedroom that had once been Thomas's, with its window that looked out toward the forest where Buddy had led Harold to his brother's final message. David would stay in the larger guest room where Harold and Martha had hosted her sister's family for holidays, where the walls were covered with old family photographs that would help tell the story of the connections they were rebuilding. But it was when Harold brought out the box of Thomas's belongings that the real conversation began. He set it carefully on the kitchen table where Martha's recipe box still sat, creating a shrine to the two people who'd shaped Harold's understanding of what family could be. "Your father left these for us to find," Harold said, opening the box with the same careful reverence he'd shown 3 days earlier when Buddy had first led him to it. "He wanted to make sure we knew how much he loved us, even if he couldn't find the courage to say it in person." David picked up the first letter with shaking hands, recognizing his father's handwriting immediately. As he read, Harold watched emotions play across his nephew's face: surprise, sadness, anger, love, regret. All the complicated feelings that came with discovering how much your understanding of someone had been incomplete. "He was dying," David said finally, looking up at Harold with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "He knew he was dying, and he spent his last months worried about whether we'd be okay without him." Harold nodded. "He was worried about you financially, worried about Emma growing up without extended family, worried that all the connections he'd tried to rebuild wouldn't survive his death. He left very detailed information about your situation, about what you might need." David's expression shifted, becoming defensive in the way that Harold recognized from his own struggles with pride. "We're not charity cases," David said firmly. "I may not have much, but I take care of my daughter. We don't need anyone's pity or handouts." Harold held up a hand, understanding the sensitivity that came with being a single parent, with feeling like the world was judging your ability to provide for your child. That's not what Thomas was suggesting. He wasn't thinking about charity. He was thinking about family, about the support the people who love each other provide for each other, not out of obligation, but out of genuine care. Harold pulled out the photograph that had affected him most deeply, a picture of Thomas holding baby Emma, both of them laughing at something outside the camera's range. The joy in Thomas's face was unmistakable, the pure delight of a grandfather who'd been given a second chance at love. "He kept this in his wallet," Harold said, handing the photograph to David. "According to the people who knew him in Millfield, he showed it to everyone, talked about you and Emma constantly. He was so proud of the father you'd become, so grateful that you'd forgiven him enough to let him be part of Emma's life." David studied the photograph for a long time, his thumb tracing the edge where it had been worn smooth by handling. "He wasn't a perfect father," David said finally. "His drinking cost us a lot of years, caused a lot of pain, but in the end, he tried to make it right. That's more than a lot of kids get." Harold felt the echo of his own relationship with Thomas in David's words. The drinking, the lost years, the late attempts at reconciliation. It was a pattern that seemed to run in their family, a cycle of pride and stubbornness that made love harder to express and forgiveness harder to offer. But Thomas had broken that cycle, at least partially, and now Harold had the chance to continue that work. Emma had been quietly looking through the other photographs while the adults talked, and now she held up a picture that made Harold's breath catch. It was Thomas and Harold as children, maybe 8 and 10 years old, standing beside the same oak tree where Harold had found the buried box. Both boys grinning at the camera with the unself-conscious joy of a summer day. "Is that you and Grandpa, Thomas?" she asked, looking back and forth between the photograph and Harold's weathered face. "That's us," Harold confirmed, remembering that day with sudden clarity. Their mother had brought the camera into the woods, had wanted to document one of their adventures before they grew too old for such games. It had been a perfect day, full of discoveries and shared secrets, before pride and disappointment had taught them to hurt each other with words. "You look happy," Emma observed with the directness that only children possessed. "We were," Harold said. "We were best friends back then. It took us a very long time to remember that." That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep in Thomas's old room with Buddy curled up beside her bed, Harold and David sat on the front porch sharing the kind of conversation that can only happen in the darkness, when the absence of eye contact makes honesty easier and the night sounds provide a gentle soundtrack for difficult truths. Harold had brought out Thomas's military medal, the Bronze Star that he'd earned during his service in Vietnam but had never talked about, not even to Harold. The medal had been wrapped in tissue paper at the bottom of the safety deposit box, along with Thomas's discharge papers and a letter of commendation from his commanding officer that praised his bravery and dedication to his fellow soldiers. "I never knew he served," Harold said, turning the medal over in his hands. "He left for the army right after our argument, but I was too proud to ask anyone what happened to him after that." I just assumed he was running away from responsibility, never considering that he might be running towards something honorable. David accepted the medal when Harold offered it to him, studying the inscription with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a father who'd been more complicated than he'd realized. Dad mentioned the war sometimes, but never in detail. Just that it had been hard, that he'd seen things that made it difficult to come home and pretend everything was normal. Harold felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Thomas's drinking, his difficulty maintaining relationships, his tendency to disappear when life got complicated. All of it made more sense when viewed through the lens of a young man who'd been traumatized by war and had never received the help he needed to process that trauma. I should have tried harder to understand, Harold said. Should have seen that his problems weren't character flaws, but wounds that needed healing. Instead, I judged him for struggling with things I'd never had to face. David was quiet for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent years trying to forgive hurts that had shaped his entire childhood. Dad told me something once when he was getting sober. He said that hurt people, and that understanding that doesn't excuse the damage they cause, but it makes forgiveness possible. He was talking about his own father's drinking, but I think it applies to your relationship with him too. Harold thought about his own father, about the man who'd struggled with alcohol and disappointment, who'd never learned to express love in ways his sons could understand. 3 generations of men who'd loved each other, but couldn't find the words or actions to make that love felt, who'd let pride and shame build walls that seemed impossible to scale. Thomas broke the cycle, Harold said finally. With you and Emma. He found a way to love that didn't depend on being perfect, didn't require solving all his problems before he could reach out. That took more courage than I ever gave him credit for. David nodded, his own understanding of his father deepening with each revelation. The last time we talked, he said he had something important to tell me, but he wanted to do it in person. He said he was working on a surprise that would make Emma's next birthday extra special. I guess I'll never know what he was planning. Harold felt his chest tighten with emotion as he realized what Thomas's surprise had probably been. The reunion. With Harold, the introduction to Emma's great-uncle, the restoration of family connections that would have given Emma the extended family that Thomas had always wanted her to have. Thomas had been planning to bring them all together, to heal the old wounds in person, rather than through buried letters and posthumous revelations. I think I know what the surprise was, Harold said, and he explained Thomas's detailed plans. For their reunion, the research he'd done into bringing David and Emma closer to the farm, the careful way he tried to orchestrate healing between people who'd been separated by time and misunderstanding. David listened with growing amazement, occasionally asking questions that helped Harold understand how much Thomas had changed. In his final years, how seriously he'd taken his role as father and grandfather, despite all the years he'd failed at it. The picture that emerged was of a man determined to redeem himself through love, to prove that it was never too late to become the person your family needed you to be. He really thought this through, David said finally. The job opportunities in the area, the school information for Emma, even the house he thought we might like. He was trying to give us a whole new life. Harold pulled out the real estate listing that Thomas had marked with notes about the property's potential. The small farmhouse just a few miles down the road that would have put David and Emma close enough for daily contact, but far enough away to maintain their independence. Thomas had even calculated the mortgage payments, had figured out ways to help with the down payment without making it feel like charity. The house is still for sale, Harold said carefully, not wanting to pressure, but unable to ignore the possibility that Thomas's plan might still be possible. I drove by it yesterday. It's a good property, well maintained, with enough land for Emma to have a pony if she wanted one. David laughed, the first genuinely relaxed sound Harold had heard from him since they'd met. Emma's been asking for a pony for 2 years. I keep telling her that apartment living and horses don't mix, but she's convinced that all she needs is enough space and the right opportunity. Harold found himself smiling too, imagining Emma's delight at the possibility of country living, of animals and space, and the kind of childhood that Harold and Thomas had shared before complications made everything difficult. "There's plenty of space here," Harold said. "Plenty of opportunity for a little girl to learn about animals and farming and all the things that make country life special." The conversation that followed was careful but hopeful, full of the kind of practical considerations that people discuss when they're trying to turn dreams into reality. David's job prospects in the area, Emma's adjustment to a new school, the logistics of moving across the country to live near family they'd only just met. But underneath the practical concerns was a growing sense that Thomas's vision for their family wasn't just possible. It was exactly what they all needed. "I can't promise anything right away," David said finally. "Emma and I have a life in Colorado, and I can't uproot her on a whim. But I can promise to think about it seriously, to consider what Dad was trying to give us." Harold felt a surge of hope that was tempered by hard-earned wisdom about the difference between possibility and certainty. "That's all Thomas would have asked for," he said. "The chance to plant the seed, to let love grow at its own pace, instead of trying to force it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds that Harold had grown accustomed to, but that David was experiencing for the first time: the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through corn, the symphony of insects that marked the transition from day to night in farm country. "It's peaceful here," David said eventually. "I can see why Dad wanted to come home." Harold felt tears start again, but they were different from the tears he'd shed over the past few days. These were tears of gratitude rather than grief, tears of hope rather than regret. Thomas had come home, in a way. His son and granddaughter were sitting on the porch where Thomas should have been, sharing the family stories and connections that Thomas had died trying to restore. "He is home," Harold said softly. "All of us being here together. This is what he wanted. This is his surprise, even if he couldn't be here to see it happen." David reached over and squeezed Harold's shoulder, the first physical contact between them that felt entirely natural, entirely right. "Thank you," he said simply, "for finding us, for making the call, for opening your home to strangers who turned out to be family. Dad would be so happy to know we're here together." Harold nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in his throat. Tomorrow they would visit Thomas's final resting place, would say the goodbyes that death had made necessary. But tonight, they were simply family, sitting together on a porch where 3 generations of their people had watched the sun set over land that had been home to them all. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as Harold prepared breakfast for his first house guests in 8 months. Emma appeared in the doorway wearing one of Thomas's old shirts that David had found in the dresser, the fabric hanging almost to her knees, but her face bright with the curiosity of a child exploring a new world. "Uncle Harold, can Buddy show me where you found Grandpa Thomas's box?" she asked, her hand already reaching for the dog who'd become her constant companion since their arrival. Harold glanced at David, who nodded his approval. "After breakfast," Harold promised. "We'll walk out there together, and I'll tell you the whole story." They ate pancakes that Harold made from Martha's recipe, the first time he'd attempted anything from her collection since her death. The kitchen felt alive in a way it hadn't for months, filled with the sounds of conversation and laughter, with Emma's endless questions about farm life and David's gradual relaxation into the rhythm of rural morning routines. After breakfast, they made their way to the forest edge where Buddy had kept his mysterious vigil. The massive oak tree stood exactly as Harold had left it, the disturbed earth at its base already beginning to show signs of healing as grass and wildflowers started to reclaim the space where Thomas's box had been buried. Harold told the story carefully, watching Emma's face as he described Buddy's strange behavior. The stormy night when everything had changed. The moment of discovery that had led them all to this reunion. Emma listened with the kind of attention that children reserve for stories that feel magical. Stories that prove that dogs are wiser than people sometimes realize, and that love can survive even the longest separations. Buddy knew Grandpa Thomas was here, Emma said with the certainty of someone young enough to accept mystery as a natural part of life. He was keeping watch until you were ready to find him. Harold looked down at Buddy, who was lying peacefully in the shade of the oak tree, his mission clearly complete, his special knowledge no longer needed. "I think you're right," Harold said. "Buddy understood something that took me much longer to figure out." David had been quiet during the story, but now he knelt beside the spot where his father's box had been buried and placed his hand flat against the earth. "Dad always said that some places hold on to love even when the people are gone," he said. "I think this is one of those places." Harold felt the truth of those words settle into his bones. This spot in the forest would always be sacred now, the place where Thomas had chosen to leave his final message, where Buddy had kept faith until Harold was ready to receive it, where the work of family healing had begun in earnest. They spent the morning exploring the farm, with Harold showing Emma the barn where Thomas had learned to milk cows, the creek where they caught their first fish, the apple orchard that their grandfather had planted, and that still produced fruit every fall. Each location came with stories, memories that Harold found he could share without. The pain that had made him avoid them for so many years. Emma absorbed it all with the enthusiasm of someone discovering her heritage, asking questions that showed she understood she was learning about her place in a larger story. She wanted to know about her great-grandmother, about Martha, about the people who'd lived on this land and shaped it into the peaceful place it had become. "Will you teach me to drive the tractor?" Emma asked as they stood beside the old John Deere that Harold used for mowing and light field work. Harold looked at David, who was smiling at his daughter's determination. "I think we can arrange some lessons," Harold said. "But you'll have to grow a little bit first, and your dad will have to be okay with it." "I'm okay with it," David said. And Harold heard something in his voice that suggested the decision about moving to be closer to the farm was already being made, even if it hadn't been spoken aloud yet. That afternoon, they drove to the Millfield Cemetery, where Thomas had been laid to rest in a simple grave, marked only with a temporary placard. Harold had brought the permanent headstone that he'd ordered that morning, a modest granite marker that would tell future generations who Thomas had been and when he'd lived. That would mark his place in the family story for as long as the stone endured. The brief ceremony was attended by the three of them, plus Bill Hensley and Susan McKay, the friends from Millfield who'd cared about Thomas during his final months. Harold read from one of Thomas's letters, the passage where he'd written about forgiveness and second chances, about the importance of love that didn't depend on being perfect. Emma placed wildflowers on the fresh grave, flowers she picked from Martha's garden that morning, with careful attention to color and arrangement. David placed his father's bronze star on the headstone, a gesture of respect for the complicated man Thomas had been, the soldier and father and brother who'd done his best with the wisdom he'd been given. Harold placed the wooden dog carving that Thomas had made in shop class, the gift that had traveled from Harold's desk to Thomas's box and back again, a symbol of the love that had survived decades of separation and misunderstanding. It was a small thing, worn smooth by time and handling, but it represented the connection that had never really been broken, only buried and waiting for the right moment to be rediscovered. As they stood beside Thomas's grave in the afternoon sunlight, Harold felt the circle closing. Thomas's mission was complete. The family was reunited. The old wounds were healing. The next generation was learning their history and their place in the continuing story. It wasn't the reunion Thomas had planned to witness, but it was the reunion he'd made possible through his patient love and careful preparation. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching Emma play with Buddy in the yard, David finally spoke the words that Harold had been hoping to hear. "I've been thinking about Dad's plan," David said. "About the house down the road, about Emma growing up with family nearby. It won't be easy to make the change, but I think it's what we need. What Emma needs." Harold felt his heart expand with a joy he hadn't experienced since Martha's death. "The house is perfect for you," he said. "Close enough that Emma can visit every day if she wants to. Far enough away that you'll have your privacy and independence. Emma's already decided she wants to learn to ride," David said, watching his daughter attempt to teach Buddy to play fetch with a stick. "She's been talking about it all day, about having a pony and learning to take care of farm animals." Harold smiled, imagining the delight of having a child on the farm again, of sharing the knowledge that his grandfather had passed to him and that he'd never had the chance to pass on. "There's a lot to learn," he said, "but there's time to learn it, and there's no better teacher than experience." They made plans that evening, practical plans about David's job search and Emma's school enrollment, about the timeline for selling their house in Colorado and buying the farmhouse down the road. But underneath the practical considerations was the deeper understanding that they were choosing to become a family in the fullest sense, choosing to honor Thomas's memory by creating the May-Chazant connections he'd envisioned as the sun set over the fields that had been home to Harold's family for 3 generations. As Emma's laughter mixed with Buddy's contented panting, as David planned a future that would keep them all connected, Harold felt Martha's presence as clearly as if she were sitting beside him in her rocking chair. She would have loved this. He knew, would have loved meeting David and Emma, would have thrown herself into the work of making them feel welcome and wanted and valued. She would have seen this reunion as proof that love was stronger than pride, that forgiveness was always possible. That family was something you created through choice as much as something you inherited through blood. Harold looked up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky and made a silent promise to Martha, to Thomas, to the generations who'd come before and those who would come after. He would be the uncle and great-uncle that Emma needed, would help David build the life that Thomas had envisioned for them, would ensure that the family healing that had begun with Buddy's mysterious vigil would continue for as long as he had breath to nurture it. The farm was home again, not just to Harold's solitary grief, but to the kind of multi-generational love that had always been its true purpose. Thomas's final gift had been the restoration of that purpose, the transformation of a place of mourning into a place of hope, where an old man's isolation could give way to a child's laughter, and where the future could finally begin to feel brighter. Then the past as they went inside for the night, Buddy took one last look toward the forest where Thomas's secret had been buried and found. Then he followed his family into the warmth of the farmhouse, his vigil complete, his loyalty rewarded, his understanding that love never really dies finally shared by the humans he'd served so faithfully. The circle was closed, the healing was begun, and tomorrow would bring new opportunities for the kind of love that Thomas had spent his final months trying to restore.